ጤና ይስጥልኝ ኢትዮጵያውያን፣ በተለይም የኢትዮጵያ ኦርቶዶክስ ምዕመናን፣ በተለይም በጣም የተማራችሁ የመንፈሳዊ ኮሌጅ ግራጁዌት ሃይስት ኤጁኬሽን ደግሞ ውጭ ሀገር የቴዎሎጂ ትምህርት የተማራችሁና የሁሉንም ሃይማኖት ጠንቅቃችሁ የምታውቁ እንደነ መምህር ዘበነ ለማ በዶክትሬት ደረጃ ያላችሁ ጳጳሳት፣ በጣም ኢንተረስቲንግ የሆነ አንድ ነገር አግኝቻለሁኝ። ይህን ታሪክ ሰምቼ ስለማዳቅ ነው። ቪዲዮ የተለቀቀው ዩቲዩብ ላይ ነው። ምን ይላል መሰላችሁ? ኢትዮጵያን ኦርቶዶክስ ዴክን and Martin Luther forgotten 1564 dialogue that shaped church unity ይላል። እንግዲህ ርዕስ የራሱን ስሜት ነው የሰጠው። ግን እኔ በዚህ ላይ በጣም የተገረምኩት ማርቲን ሉተር ኪንግ ከኢትዮጵያዊው ዲያቆን ጋር ያደረገው ክርክር የተረሳ ታሪክ ብሎ ነው የቀረበው። ማርቲን ሉተር ኪንግ ማን ነው? ብዙዎች እንግዲህ እስከማውቀው ድረስ የካቶሊክ ጳጳስ የነበረና የጴንጤን ሃይማኖት የፈጠረው ከካቶሊክ ፕሮቴስት አድርጎ ፕሮቴስታንት የሚባል ሃይማኖት ጀመረ። እዛም ኮንፊውዝድ ነበረ ማለት ነው በካቶሊክም። ለዛም ነው ተገንጥሎ የወጣው። ሆኖም ግን ጴንጤን ሲመሰርት የኢትዮጵያውን ዲያቆንና በአስተርጓሚ ነው የሚነጋገሩት። እንግዲህ ወደደም ጠላም ቀደም ሲል እንደምታውቁት ክርስትና መጀመሪያ የገባው አፍሪካ ውስጥ ነው እያሉ ኢትዮጵያን ሳይጠቅሱ የሚናገሩ ሌሎች አፍሪካውያኖችን እንትን ላይ ያየው ነው። ብዙ ቪዲዮ ላይ ቻለሁኝ። ክርስትና የአፍሪካ ነው የሚሉት። እንደውም እነሱ ክርስትና የዓለም ነው እንጂ የአፍሪካ ብቻ አይደለም። እና የመጀመሪያ ክርስትና ወደ ኢትዮጵያ እንዴት ገባ የሚለውን አብዛኛው እንግዲህ መሰረታዊ የኢትዮጵያ ኦርቶዶክስ ተዋሕዶ ክርስትናን እምነት እንደ አንድ ተራ ክርስቲያን የምናውቀው እንኖራለን። የማያውቁም አሉ። ግን መጀመሪያ ክርስትና ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ የገባው በዘመነ ሐዋርያ ክርስቶስ በሰበከ ዘመን ክርስቶስ ከተንሥአ እሙታን በኋላ ይሁን በፊት ለሐዋርያት የሰጣቸው ምስክርነትና የወንጌል ትምህርት አለ። ወደ ዓለም ከመጣ ጀምሮ ከድንግል ማርያም በቅዱስ መንፈስ ከተወለደ ጀምሮ ወንጌልን ሲያስተምር ኖሯል። 12ቱን ሐዋርያቶችም እያስተማረ ባለበት ዘመን ነው ኢትዮጵያዊ ጃንደረባ፣ እንግዲህ ጃንደረባ ማለት የገንዘብ ሚኒስትር ማለት ነው። የንግስት እንደኬ ደግሞ የኢትዮጵያ ንግስት ነች። ሊጎበኝ ሄደ። ሲጎበኝ ሄዶ ሐዲስ ኪዳን ተጽፎ ነበርና ያነባል። አግኝቶ ሲያነብ አልገባውም። ግን በተቀመጠበት ሰረገላ ላይ ክርስቶስ እግዚአብሔር ማን ላከለት? ሐዋርያው ፊልጶስን ላከለት። በሐዋርያት ዘመን እንግዲህ እየዞሩ በሚሰብኩበት ሰዓት ነው። ከዛ የምታነቦ ይገባሃልን? እኔ መምህር የለኝም እንዴት ይገባኛል አለ። መጣና አስተማረው። ክርስትና ተዋሕዶ ክርስትና እኔን የጀመረችው እና እዚህ ቪዲዮ ላይ ምንድነው እኔ አሁን ንግግሬ እንዳበቃ ትሰማላችሁ። ቆርጬዋለሁ። ሙሉውን ከፈለጋችሁ አፍሪ ጎድ የሚል የዩቲዩብ አካውንት ነው። እዛ ላይ ሙሉውን ታገኙታላችሁ። እኔ የ15 ደቂቃ የሚሆነውን ግን አሁን ንግግሬ እንዳበቃ እለቀዋለሁ፣ ትሰሙታላችሁ። በጣም የሚገርም በጣም ኢንትረስቲንግ ነው። ግን በዩክርስትና በትሪኒቲ ያለው ልዩነት እኔ አላውቅም። ትሪኒቲን ግን አውቃለሁ በሃይማኖቴ ስለሆነ ስላሴ ማለት ነው። አብ ወልድ መንፈስ ቅዱስ ነው። ይህንን ቪዲዮ ነጋሽ ሚዲያዎችን እንደ አደራ ስጡልኝ። ለምሁራኖችና መምህር ዘበነ ለማ ሃይስት የሚባለውን የመንፈሳዊ ኮሌጅ እስከ ዶክትሬት የተማሩ ናቸው። የሁሉንም ሃይማኖት ልዩነት ደግሞ ጠንቅቃ ይማሩታል፣ ያውቁታል። የሁሉንም ቴዎሎጂ ሲማሩ የሁሉንም ሃይማኖት ልዩነቶቻችንን ስለሚያውቁት ይሄ ነገር ታሪኩን ታውቁታላችሁን? በኢትዮጵያ ኦርቶዶክስ ተዋሕዶ ክርስቲያን ይሄ ክርክር መደረጉ ይታወቃል። ጥያቄ ነው። ምክንያቱም ስለ ኒቂያ ጉባኤ እና የተለያዩ ጉባኤዎች ክርክሮች ድሮ ተደርገዋል። ይሄ ግን ሰምቼ ስለማላቅ ነው፣ አዲስ ነገር ነው። እና ነጋሽ ሚዲያን አድርሱልኝ ባካችሁ። ይሄንን ድምጼን ያዳመጣችሁ በጣም የሚገርም ነው። ኢትዮጵያዊ ዲያቆንና ማርቲን ሉተር ኪንግ የጴንጤ መስራቹ በ1534 ዓመተ ምህረት ሙሉ ጽሁፉ ምን ይላል? ከርዕስ ሄዲንግ ላይን ዩቱብ አካውንት ላይ የተጻፈው ኢትዮጵያን ኦርቶዶክስ ዲክን አንድ ማርቲን ሉተር ፎርጎትን 1534 ዳያሎግ ዛት ሼፕድ ቸርች ዩኒቲ ይላል። እንዲህ አይነት ክርክር መደረጉ ከአንድ ኢትዮጵያዊ ዲያቆን ጋር ማርቲን ሉተር ኪንግ በ1534 ዓ ም እንደ አውሮፓ አቆጣጠር ክርክር አድርገው ነበር ክርስትናን አስመልክቶ ወይም መጽሐፍ ቅዱስን አስመልክቶ እና ይሄንን ነገር ገና ርዕሱን ሳየው ወዲያው ነው ክሊክ አድርጌ አዳመጥኩኝ። ሳዳምጥ ሙሉም በቃ የሚገርም ነገር ነው የሚከራከሩት። ግን በዚህ ጉዳይ ላይ የኢትዮጵያ ኦርቶዶክስ ተዋሕዶ ቤተክርስቲያን ይሄ ክርክር መደረጉን ታውቃለች ወይ ነው ጥያቄው። እና ስላዳመጣችሁ አመሰግናለሁ። ለ15 ደቂቃ ቆርጬ ያስቀመጥኩትን ደግሞ የእንግሊዝኛውን ሰውየው የሚናገረውን አዳምጡት። በጣም ነው የገረመኝ። ያልተጠበቀ ነገር ነው። እኛ የኒቂያ ጉባኤ የተለያዩ ክርክሮች ተደርጓል ድሮ እና በክርክር እነ አትናቴዎስ የኦርቶዶክስ ተዋሕዶ ተከራካሪዎች አሸንፈው እንደነበርና ይኸው እስካሁን ድረስ አለች የኢትዮጵያ ኦርቶዶክስ ተዋሕዶ ክርስትና። በኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ ብቻ አይደለም፣ በሶሪያ፣ በኤርትራ፣ በግብፅ፣ በአርመን፣ የህንድ ኦርቶዶክስ ራሱ የኛ ተዋሕዶ ናቸው። በእነሱ ሁሉ አሉ አሁን እና እስቲ ይህንን ድምፄን እንደዋድርሱልኝ ለነጋሽ ሚዲያ። እነ ነጋሽ ሚዲያ ደግሞ ይህንን ነገር ትኩረት ሰጥተው አንድ ነገር ያቀርባሉ የሚል ተስፋ አለኝ። ክርስቲያን ተስፋ አይቆርጥም። ሰላምና ጤና እግዚአብሔር ይስጠን ለሁላችን። አሜን።
Here's what we know. On May 31st, 1534, Martin Luther records in a letter that he had a dialogue with a Christian from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church named Michael the Deacon.
Luther esteemed the Church of Ethiopia because he thought Ethiopia was the first nation in history to convert to Christianity.
To propose 4 bold claims about Martin Luther and the Ethiopian Christianity.
Welcome to AfriGod, where we reveal Africa's hidden impact on church history. Here, Dr. Gavin Ortland calls this encounter a goldmine for ecumenical theology, since both sides affirmed the kingdom of Christ is spiritual righteousness of heart, fear of God, and trust through Christ. Meanwhile, Dr. David D. Daniels III highlights how Luther saw Ethiopian Christianity as the older, wiser black sibling of European churches, and even incorporated its practices into his own reforms. Now it's your turn, after hearing both Dr. Ortland and Dr. Daniels. Who then counts as Christ's true body? And how rich is our practice of the Lord's Supper? Decide for yourself whether this 500-year-old conversation still speaks to today's global church. And join us as we rediscover Africa's role in the Reformation. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments below.
Okay, here's what we know. On May 31st, 1534, Martin Luther records in a letter that he had a dialogue with a Christian from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church named Michael the Deacon. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is one of the Oriental Orthodox churches, which resulted from the split at the Council of Chalcedon in the 5th century. Michael stayed in Wittenberg for over a month, leaving on July 4th. During that time, both Luther and Melanchthon were around, and they had several meetings with Michael. Now, Michael could speak some Italian, and so there was a student at the University of Wittenberg who spoke Italian and translated, and amazingly, the dialogue seems to have gone positively, surprisingly well. They came to theological agreement even on the Eucharist and on the Trinity, and ultimately Luther extended full fellowship to Deacon Michael and to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, something he didn't extend to Zwingli, and Michael apparently reciprocated with an affirmation of the Lutherans as possessing good doctrine. Now, we need to be careful here. Been trying to, I don't want to go too far. There's lots of reasons to be careful. These various figures don't represent everyone on their respective sides. This is not a formal council or something like that. Also, our information about it is limited, and the dialogue did have language and cultural barriers. I think probably the biggest reason to be careful is that their agreement with each other might have been easier in that context insofar as it served other polemics that they were engaged in. So we have to factor all that in. Nonetheless, this episode is very significant. Here you have an African Christian right in the cradle of the Reformation, sitting at the table with Luther himself. It's just amazing. And it's astonishing that at the height of the polemics of that time, Luther, Michael, and Melanchthon could sit at the table, look across to each other and say, you're a Christian and we're part of the same church and you have a valid Eucharist and we have the same basic faith. Amazing. For that time, that's pretty astonishing, and it raises lots of questions for us to work through today. Now, I'm not alone in seeing this episode is very significant. David Daniels, who's done some great work in this area, calls it significant and compares it to the colloquy between Luther and Zwingli. That's at Marburg 5 years earlier. We'll talk about that later. Stanislaw Palau, a leading scholar on this episode from whom I'm drawing a lot for this video, calls this event the first significant Protestant Orthodox encounter, and then writes, it's not the mere fact of such an early encounter between an Ethiopian Orthodox monk and the German reformers that make it extraordinarily significant. Of high importance is rather its theological dimension. Here's the issue. This intercultural dialogue about the core issues of the Christian doctrine resulted in a mutually shared conviction that Ethiopian Orthodox Christians and proponents of the Wittenberg Reformation belong to the very same Church of Christ. That's the issue. That's what we're going to explore here and say, what do we do with that? What do we make of that? It's kind of amazing. And to me, it's like tremendously encouraging and positive in some ways. Now, although this dialogue was with the Lutherans, we can say that this has implications for other kinds of Protestants as well, because Palaslau suggests that the very fact that the Ethiopian monk had a letter of recommendation drawn up suggests he was seeking further contact with other representatives of the Reformation. And from another letter of Melanchthon's, we know that Michael did intend to go to France, apparently to meet with Martin Bucer. So we don't know whether that ever happened, but we know that was his intent. So in other words, we shouldn't say like, well, Michael liked the Lutherans but didn't care about the Reformed or something like that. This has broader implications for the rest of Protestantism as well. Now, before Michael left, Luther and Melanchthon issued a formal letter of recommendation to him. This is written by Melanchthon, signed by Luther. This is the key document for interpreting this event. I'm going to read this whole thing. It's amazing, and we'll just work through it. Before I read it, though, let me do a book recommendation, because people often ask me about Bible translations. This book is fresh out. It's a great book. It's called Bible Translations for Everyone by Tim Wildsmith. This is a great resource. Basically, it explains how Bible translations work. So it gets into translation philosophy and tells the story of early English Bible translations like Wycliffe and Tyndale and the King James Version, something I'm interested in. I've been doing videos on recently. There's over 400. Did you know this? Over 400 English translations of the Bible. And so, but this goes through the major ones and just gives you pros and cons and helps you understand what's the history behind translations and then which one could be best for me. So I'm going to put a link to this in the video description. If that's of interest to you, I highly recommend it. All right, here's the letter. I'll read the whole thing. You'll see how significant this is and how I'm so excited to work through this. Mr. Michael. Oh, no, I'll start at the beginning. A letter of recommendation given to an Ethiopian by Mr. Martin Luther. Philip Melanchthon drafted it. Mr. Michael, an Ethiopian deacon, was with us in Germany. We spoke with him about the Christian doctrine on friendly terms and heard him rightly agree with the creed that the Western Church holds. Nor does he think about the Trinity any differently than what the Western Church thinks. We'll come back to that in a moment. Therefore, as much as we can, we recommend him to good people. For although the Eastern Church observes some divergent ceremonies, he judges, that's Michael, that this difference does not undermine the unity of the Church nor conflict with faith, because the kingdom of Christ is spiritual righteousness of heart, fear of God, and trust through Christ. We, too, approve of this opinion. We also learn from him that the rite, which we observe at the Lord's Supper and the Mass, is in accord with the Eastern Church. Moreover, we desire that all peoples acknowledge and glorify Christ and obey him through true trust in his mercy and through love of the neighbor. Therefore, we entreat good people that they, too, would show Christian love to this visitor. Wittenberg, July 4th, 1534, Martin Luther. Amazing. All right, let's work through this a little bit. The two main points of discussion referenced here that seem to have been some of the main themes in their dialogue are the Trinity and the Lord's Supper. Now, it's surprising that they would find agreement on these, especially with regard to the Trinity. You just wonder, later on, the Ethiopian Christians will have dialogue with Jesuit theologians and things like the Filioque will come up. There's also complexities in the Ethiopian conception of the Trinity that you wonder if those even came up here in the dialogue. The 15th century Emperor Zara Yacob, whom I discussed in my previous video on Father Estefanos, had introduced the notion that the image of God refers to physical features, and then these can be attributed in some sense to the Trinity. Surely this is something Luther and Melanchthon would not agree to if it had come up. But of course, the big issue is the Filioque clause, which was such a contributor to division between the East and the West. Luther and Melanchthon affirmed the Filioque, and they would have inherited a narrative, a history that would have made that affirmation seem obviously correct. Michael, of course, would not have held to that view. For him, the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed would have simply always lacked the Filioque clause. And so we can just ask, how can they agree on the Trinity in light of a difference like this? It's an interesting question. What some have argued is that they simply didn't understand the differences and how significant they were, or they simply didn't come up, or something like this. I think this is kind of how Palaslao is thinking of it. He's saying, remember that in this historical context, there's such less knowledge of each other. Perhaps when they're discussing the Trinity, they're talking about other things like the word homoousion and things like this. But on the other hand, the Ethiopian Orthodox, this is why I'm not really persuaded of that. The Ethiopian Orthodox Christians had a presence in Northeast Africa and to some extent in Latin Europe. At this time in history, they had communities in Egypt, several places in Egypt. They had monastic communities also on the island of Cyprus and even in Rome. Some people think that Michael may have belonged to an Ethiopian monastic community in Rome, and this would then explain how he knew Italian, I meant to say. Whether that's the case or not, the very fact that he knew Italian suggests he has some awareness of events in European Christianity. Surely he's aware of the Filioque clause. I mean, this is a big deal, right? And then they have multiple dialogues for over a month. So how likely is it that it just wouldn't come up at all if they're talking about the Trinity? Another explanation is maybe it came up, but it simply didn't register for them as an absolute deal breaker on the more general agreement on the Trinity. That seems more plausible, but whatever the case, it's noteworthy that they were able to express agreement on such a foundational doctrine as the Trinity. Again, today we might take something like that for granted, but back at this time, the division between the East and the West was so profound. The other area of common ground that's also amazing is the Eucharist. They seem to have come together against the Roman Catholics on the one side and the Zwinglians and Anabaptists on the other side. So they both affirmed real presence against the Zwinglians and the Anabaptists, some of the Anabaptists. And they both affirmed communion in both kinds over and against the Roman Catholics. Luther also found it significant, the absence of private masses in Ethiopia, since he thought that was an innovation introduced by Gregory the Great. And so Luther and Melanchthon later on are going to appeal to Ethiopian practice when it comes to critiquing the idea of a private mass. Now, again, if they were to talk through, we don't want to make too much of this, if they were to talk through every point of Eucharistic theology, surely some differences would have emerged, just like with the Trinity. Nonetheless, that they could arrive upon agreement on this point is significant. Remember, Luther didn't even accept Zwingli on account of this issue. And here he is with this Ethiopian Christian, and they have full affirmation of each other. It's amazing. Now, so those are two particular points, the Trinity and the Eucharist. Here's the great and obvious and shining conclusion that stands out from this episode. These German reformers and this African monk are able to see each other as a part of the same church. Now, to me, who's very interested in these questions, this is, again, just like an amazing discovery. It's like finding water in the desert or something like that. Because we take this kind of vision for granted today very often. But in the context of the 16th century, where Christians are constantly killing each other, this is not to be assumed. And the recognition is not because they're simply naive to differences. They have multiple conversations over longer than a month, and they acknowledge the differences. You heard that language in the letter. They're divergent ceremonies, but they're just not seen as essential. So they're basically doing here what I call theological triage. You can note these words again. Although the Eastern Church observes some divergent ceremonies, Michael judges this difference does not undermine the unity of the church. And this amazing sentence about what the kingdom of Christ consists of, it is triaging issues. And significantly, that is recorded as being approved by both parties. Later, Luther summarizes this dialogue as follows. 3 years ago, there was an Ethiopian monk with us with whom we had a discussion through an interpreter. He summed up all our articles of faith by saying this is a good creda, that is, faith. And in a sermon around that same time, 3 years later, Luther is preaching on the unity of the church, and he references an Ethiopian person as a fellow Christian, that's presumably Michael, to make a point about the importance of the unity of the body of Christ. Now, here's the point. What is assumed in such a judgment that this African Christian, these European reformers, they're a part of one church, is the absence of a strict institutional conception of the church. Okay, what is assumed is that you're able to look at Christians on the other side of the world with whom you don't have any formal relationship and say, oh, we're a part of the same church. And it's assumed that there's value in recognizing that kind of unity. And this reflects something of the ecclesiological self-understanding of the early Protestants. That means just how they understood their effort as the church. They were not trying to sweep all the pieces off the chessboard and start afresh. You see, we often look back at early Protestantism and we see it only or mainly in relation to the polarizing relationship with Rome, where it's a more negative identity. This is a counterbalancing consideration when you see their relationship with Eastern Christians, like those of Ethiopia, but it's not just the Ethiopians. 40 years later, in the 1570s, other Lutherans will write to Jeremiah II, Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople. So this is Eastern Orthodoxy, not Oriental. And they give a copy of the Augsburg Confession. They have this dialogue. You can see something of their mentality that I've talked a lot about elsewhere. I have a video on this too, where they say, we desire from the bottom of our hearts to preserve a God-pleasing peace with all who love the gospel of Christ, who hold to the right interpretation of Christ, the unique teacher who speaks to us through the words of the Old as well as the New Testaments. We do not innovate on matters of faith. That sentence, that sentiment seems to recall this sentence. I'm not saying it is referencing, but it's very similar to this sentence from Melanchthon's letter. Moreover, we desire that all peoples acknowledge and glorify Christ and obey him through true trust in his mercy and through the love of neighbor. So what do we do with all this? What do we make sense? How does this apply to us today? Well, let me just give two challenges to Protestant viewers, and then beyond that, just encourage more reflection on this important story. First, if during the height of the polemics of the Reformation, 2 Germans and 1 Ethiopian from traditions vastly separated were able to sit down at a table, look across at each other and say, we're a part of the same larger church,